You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
There was an underground railroad in California, and there was a mass exodus in 1858 of 800 African Americans who fled to Vancouver. So I think we're living with a series of myths because California was and has been a slave state.
Hello, and welcome to episode 387 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think of California, our minds might conjure sunny weather, Hollywood, beaches, wine country, or perhaps even the gold rush. What we don't usually think about when we think about California is the state's long history with slavery. Jean Felser, a Californian and a professor emerita of English, Asian Studies, and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware, joins us to lead us through some of California's long 250-year history of slavery with details from her book, California, a Slave State. Now, during our investigation of California's slave past, Jean reveals the great diversity of California's indigenous populations prior to Spanish colonization, details about how and why the Spanish, Russians, Americans, and Chinese brought different forms of slavery to California, and the truth about the myth that California entered the United States Union as a free state in 1850. But first, if you can believe it, our 400th episode will be published in December, and we need your help to figure out how we should celebrate. So what kind of episode would you like to hear for episode 400? Right now, we're asking this question of members of our listener community on Facebook. But if you're not on Facebook, you can still tell us what you think by sending me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Right now, the idea in the lead is asking a group of former guests a big question about history, just like we did in episode 300. And that way we can gather their many different insights into that question. So join our listener community on Facebook or send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, and tell me what you think about this idea or share your own idea for how we should mark episode 400. This will be exciting, and I'm so glad we'll have your input so that we can create a really great episode. All right, are you ready to explore the early history of California and the state's slave past? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is a professor emerita of English, Asian Studies, and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware. She is an internationally recognized scholar and public intellectual who speaks on issues of migration, resistance, oppression, and survival. She's also written several books, including California, a Slave State. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jean Felser.
Thank you for having me.
So the title of Jean's book, California, a Slave State, is really a play on the fact that if we were to look at the history of when California entered the United States as a state, we would find that in 1850, California entered the Union as, quote, a free state. But Jean, as you detail in your book, slavery was really something that had always existed in California, at least since the start of European colonization. So Jean, would you give us an overview of California before the Spanish began their colonization, and tell us who lived in California, what their lives were like, and whether indigenous Californians had any concept of the similar geographic boundaries for California like we would see on a map today?
Thank you for that question because it sets the frame for why I called the book California, a Slave State. California has had over 250 years of slavery, so it has a very long duration as a slave state. Our story begins with slavery in 1769. The first invaders of California were the Spanish, who enter in 1769, and they brought slavery with them. Before that, anthropologists and Native American scholars and historians believe that There were native people living in California for at least 10,000 years. Some claim even 20,000 years. The estimates are about 250 tribes. Unlike the big Indian nations, as they're called in the East, these were much smaller groups of people, geographically divided by languages. There were at least 100, some people say 200, depending on dialect, different languages in California. And the Spanish intention was to invade California and establish a system of missions, copied with slightly different intentions from what they were already doing in Mexico and Peru in the silver mines and in the Spanish colonies and plantations as well. The era of, quote, discovery, which of course it's a misnomer, California existed. The first Spaniard to see California was Juan Cabrillo, and he enters California in 1542. And then there were a series of Spanish explorers who followed Cabrillo. In 1769, the Spanish enter with a very clear intention. They are going to set up 4 military districts, which they'll call presidios, and their goal was to set up 19 missions. Ultimately, because they're worried about the Russians coming from the north, they end up setting up 21 missions. But the original plan was for there to be 19 missions. The people who they were about to try and conquer were the coastal people of California. Our story today of the missions and the conquest by the Spanish is pretty much going to stick to the 800 miles of coastline from San Diego up to Oregon. And depending on how you chart the coves and the inlets and the river systems, that's about 800 miles that was available and desired by Spanish conquest. In fact, they don't go that far. They go as far as Sonoma County, north of San Francisco. So from San Diego to about 50, 80 miles north of San Francisco, Napa Valley, Sonoma County, what's now called the wine country, is the area of Spanish conquest. The Native Americans in California were totally separate from the Native Americans in the rest of the United States. There seemed to be no ties of language, no family ties, relational ties, even DNA ties to the tribes of the plains. And that has to do with California. Picture this. There's the 800 miles of coastland, and then there's a long chain of mountains that are variously connected. Generally, they're part of the Sierras or the Sierra Madre Mountains that pretty much walled off Northern California from the rest of what would become the United States. And then below the Sierras, they sort of morph into deserts, mainly the Mojave Desert, where there were Native American people living. But for people coming from the outside, climates of 120 degrees, the hot sand, what appeared to be unlivable, although Native people absolutely lived on that land. But there was a barrier of mountains and deserts that walled off California geographically from the rest of the United States. The Native Americans in California didn't define their land by borders. They defined their land by the land that they lived on, the land that they could take care of. There were no geographic borders, and there were no geographic wars. California was so lush with everything coming from the sea, the salmon, the crab, the sturgeon, the steelhead, seals, otters, whales coming from the sea. And on land, there was a rich population of protein from deer and elk and bear and small rodents. And then the land was lush with berries and nuts and acorns and wood. So they didn't need borders. And when I first began to look at the relations between the tribes, I was just struck by the fact that there weren't tribal wars. Without tribal wars, you didn't have any quantity of slavery. There were tussles over people, over marriages, and occasionally there was a skirmish and a prisoner of war was taken. But there weren't notable wars along the coast. There weren't borders. There weren't treaties. I think a lot about scarcity and how bad scarcity is. Scarcity is bad in relationships, not enough money, not enough love, not enough jobs. Scarcity is bad politically and causes stress and friction. But there wasn't a whole lot of scarcity in California. And all of these tribes, they lived brilliantly within the ecosystems they inhabited. And they lived very differently depending on where they were. But they weren't duking it out in tribal wars. And because the geography is so divided with the mountains, the valleys, the streams, the river systems, there just wasn't a lot of friction between the tribes and the landscape. Occasionally, as I said, there were slaves who were a spoil of war, but these were noticeably absent and small and irregular. So that's the situation, the land that the Spanish entered into in 1769.
You mentioned that because early California was a land with plentiful resources that had enough space for every one of the estimated 250 indigenous tribes who lived and are still living in California, that warfare between California tribes just wasn't an issue because people weren't competing for the natural resources that they needed to live. And so without prolonged periods of warfare, California tribes didn't really have a reason to enslave and take war captives. But we do know that slavery came to California. So Jean, would you tell us more about the Spanish mission system and the connection between the mission system and the Spaniards' introduction of slavery and enslavement in early California?
Sure. The Spanish enter with a few goals. This was a deliberate and planned entry. It's endorsed by the Pope. The Pope has sent to Spain a papal bull requiring the conversion of the native people. And actually, they guessed pretty well that there would be 200,000 to 300,000 Native Americans available for conversion to Catholicism. So conversion was one goal. And we don't think about this a lot. But the Russians are coming down from the north. This is all going on at the same time as we are building the American Revolution and the Constitution and the colonies, and the war with England is happening 3,000 miles across the country. But Spain had been tussling with Russia over empire in Europe. And the Russians are going to enter from the north looking for sea otters. They've come across Alaska. They're going to turn right, come down the coast, and Spain absolutely knows that the Russians are coming. So they want to block the Russians and to use the mission system that they had set up in Mexico and Peru. The other thing is that this is an empire country that's making fortunes off of the silver mines in Mexico and Peru. And they didn't want to take the native people who were enslaved by the Spaniards in Mexico and Peru away from mining, and they needed food. And so they had this vision, this utopian California dreaming vision that California would feed the system of slavery in Mexico down to Peru and support the miners, and also to support the other missions that were not doing well. There were tensions between the Franciscans and the Jesuits, and the mission system in Mexico was hurting. And this was going to be the solution, was to start another mission system in Alta California, High or Upper California, for these three purposes of empire, of food, and of Catholic conversion. So indeed, that's what happens. Junipero Serra, Father Serra, is appointed the head of the theological part of the mission, and he's got a companion in Portola who's heading up the military mission. Serra is in terrible shape. He walks 1,000 miles to meet up with Portola at the border. He's got an infected leg. He leaves with a loaf of bread. He decides he's going to do this hike barefoot. And we can picture that mountainous, rocky desert land. And he's going to beg. And he's actually begging from converts from the missions in Mexico for food. And indeed, they meet up at the border and join forces. And they're going to invade California by land and by sea. So they split off. 3 boats sail from Vallecata and sail north to San Diego. 2 of the boats make it, and almost half of those sailors die. Then the other group, led by Sarah and Portola, walk across the border. The native people of California did not have the horse. And that also determines their mobility, the kind of food they could reach, and how they become available for conquest. Because the horse is an incredibly powerful force of mobility, of war, and they also enter with cattle. So in 1769, the people coming by land get there first. And they enter where the Kumeyaay people and the Ipai people live. And they're the first Indians to be conquered or attempt to be conquered. And that's where Junipero Serra plans to set up the first mission. So that's the intention of why they're coming, and that's how they come. Half of the people who invade California die in the invasion, not by the Kumeyaay people, but by disease, seasickness, malaria. It's a horrific voyage by land or by sea. The first thing that the Kumeyaay see is these weird people coming across their land. The Kumeyaay were on both sides of what we would now call the Mexican border. So their people know that these people are coming. They don't understand that they're being invaded. They're very curious. They're not hostile because they hadn't had this experience before. What they see are the priests. There are about 100 soldiers and 8 priests. And they see the priests wearing these heavy, long gray robes where they can barely see out of their hoods. And they think this is nuts. Why in this warm, sunny Southern California climate are people dressed in these very heavy gray woolen garments? They also see that the people aren't painted. The tribes in Southern California would paint their bodies as a way of protecting against insects and protecting against the sun. Why aren't these people protecting their bodies? The next thing they see is them unloading the ships in what's San Diego Harbor. And they're seeing that half of the people coming off the ships are dead, and that the first thing that the Spanish have to do is bury their dead. So this is not a very persuasive invasion if you're looking to convert people. So the Kumeyaay are curious, and the Spanish are determined.
Now, Junipero Serra and his men established the first Spanish mission in California at San Diego in mid-July 1769. They called this mission Mission San Diego Acala. Now, perhaps you've had the chance to visit a California mission. If you have, you'll notice that the Spanish generally established mission complexes where there was a good water supply and enough land where they could build a church, a central courtyard in front of that church, and outbuildings around these religious spaces that served as things like church offices, workshops, kitchens, and dormitories. And outside of this central mission complex, you would have also found plenty of farm fields. Jean, would you tell us how the Spanish attracted California's indigenous peoples into their missions and what their day-to-day lives were like once they were living in these missions?
There are several ways that conquest occurred. One of the padres, the fathers, says, we're going to conquer through the mouth. The first thing that they do is let loose their cattle and their horses on what were Native American seed fields. The seed fields were something I didn't know about. The California natives planted these vast seed fields, especially in Southern California, and the game would come onto the fields and they'd be hanging out. and they would wait for the game to come to them. And then with a bow and arrow, they would kill the game. So immediately the cattle are hungry, the horses are hungry, and the Spanish let them loose on these fertile Native American seed fields. The horses urinate and defecate and stomp down the fields. And it's a setup for hunger for the native people to have their sources of protein, their hunting grounds destroyed. So food was always a form of conquest. And then they really believed that Catholicism would be so compelling and attractive that people would come to voluntarily convert, and then they would work for them. The missions are, in fact, plantations. They're vast farms, and they're going to be worked by the native people of California. And some of them come out of curiosity, but most of them come hoping for food, and many of them are captured. One of the ways they were captured is that the soldiers, the soldados, would go into the native villages, and they would have long ropes with loops on them. And they would bring in chains of native people looped by rope around their necks across the mission system to bring them into the missions and force them to labor. The native people were allowed to leave until they were baptized. If they accept baptism, then they were never allowed to leave again. But the notion of how voluntary and intentional baptism was is up for dispute given the conditions of captivity. So violence, captivity, hunger, and curiosity brought people toward the missions. And then once they were in the missions, the assaults began. There was a deep and systematic and implemented system of rape in the missions. Junipero Serra writes letter after letter back to the mother mission in Laredo, Mexico, saying, we're not going to be able to keep people here as long as these rapes go on. What we now know is that the rapes were not just by the soldiers, but they were by the priests. And they were very organized and traumatic and compelled a kind of fear and traumatic obedience. There was constant flogging, constant whipping. Minor infractions got you 25 floggings a day over a period of 60 days. The 4 presidios that get built very quickly in the first decades are military forts, but they're also brutal prisons. So with minor infractions, you were sent to a presidio. Since there were only 4, it could be very far from home. So there was systematic fear as well as the attraction. And it's very interesting to read how deeply faithful the priests were. It's very hard for me to believe in this notion of conversion under these circumstances. But within about 10 days, under the first 2 weeks, Junipero Serra holds a mass on the beach. And the Kumeyaay were really curious about what were these golden embroidered robes and what was the gold cross. And they're very curious about an image, a painting of the Madonna and the Child. In fact, they're so curious, Sarah sends for some cheap reproductions, thinking that a print of the Madonna and the Child is going to do the deed. Although there was nothing like these paintings in the rock painting, the land painting of native traditions in Southern California. And it's not surprising that native people were just curious tourists about what this was all about. So those were some of the ways that they were attracted. And the life that was offered them was harsh. They were required to work in the fields or be beaten. They were required to build the churches, and each mission had a little cathedral. And the soldiers were required to build their own barracks. There are very serious divisions between the soldiers and the priests. And the priests are terrified of the soldiers. They're terrified of the Indians, and they're terrified of the soldiers. They figure their best bet is to be on the side of the soldiers so they don't stop the rapes. and they don't stop the violence. They also had a fourth reason to come, which was eugenics. They had the idea that they could conquer California by having the soldiers mate with indigenous women and create a new Spanish population in California. So there were all of these different systems of control and violence that they used to bring natives into the mission system. The missions were small, they were decrepit, there would be a cross. And the natives who are trapped in the mission system are required to show up for Mass. Their lives, which had been controlled by the seasons and the rhythms of nature, are suddenly now controlled by the bell. The bell calls them to meals. The bell heals for work. It's not the freedom of constructing their lives around sustenance and pleasure and ritual and prayer that they had evolved in all of their own terms. And each of the tribes had different sets of rituals.
It sounds like Indigenous Californians had many reasons that they might go to a mission. As you stated, some were just curious about Christianity, so they went to a mission to learn more. Others were captured, and then they were brought to the mission forcibly, where they were enslaved and forced to build the churches and the mission complex, and then to labor in the fields. And still many more were just starving, because the Spanish had unleashed horses and domesticated animals on their seed fields, and so they went to the missions to seek food and relief from their starvation. Jean, you also mentioned that the missions were violent places, that once Indigenous peoples got there, it may not have seen the peaceable place that it may have seen from the outside. On the inside, there was lots of violence where Indigenous peoples experienced physical and sexual assault at the hands of both priests and soldiers. Now, I know many of us must be thinking, you can't just serve up violence against a population and expect that there will be no resistance and no violence in return. So, Jean, after we take a moment to thank our episode's sponsor, I hope you'll tell us about the many forms of Indigenous resistance to the Spanish and to the Spanish missions. As we get ready to commemorate, celebrate, and reflect on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, we should remember that we're part of a longer tradition of marking these historic occasions. For example, 200 years ago, Americans prepared to commemorate 50 years of American independence and democracy. As part of their commemoration, they invited the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, to return to the United States to help them mark the occasion. On August 16, 1824, Lafayette arrived in New York Harbor and disembarked to a crowd of more than 80,000 Americans lining the streets of Manhattan. Lafayette's landing in New York marked the start of a 13-month tour of the United States, which at the time consisted of 24 states. Now, none of us were alive 200 years ago to witness this grand event and celebration, but we can witness a recreation of parts of Lafayette's grand tour in 2024 and 2025. On August 16, 2024, in honor of the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's grand tour of the United States, the American Friends of Lafayette organization will kick off a recreation of Lafayette's return to the United States. To learn more about Lafayette 200 and how and where you can attend one of its events, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Lafayette 200. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Lafayette 200. Jean, would you take us through the ways Indigenous peoples in California resisted the Spanish and their missionization and conversion efforts?
I didn't know this. I grew up in California. I was born in Los Angeles. I took the field trips to the missions. I grounded acorn in my class. I was before the tradition of the fourth grade mission project. The fourth grade mission projects were a very idealized way of teaching the mission system in California. And I had no idea of the brutality, and I had no idea of the slave revolts. We can start right in San Diego with the Kumeyaay. Sarah arrives in 1769, and most of the people forced to be at the mission were Kumeyaay people. And in 1775, just 6-7 years later, the Kumeyaay plan a revolt. The Kumeyaay were a very large group of people, and they're up in the mesas that form the eastern border of San Diego. They're villages or clan settlements along the coast. In a totally coordinated way, they plan a revolt for 1775. They meet, they make new arrows, they strengthen the animal sinews so that their bows are strong, they build new bows, and they're holding meeting after meeting to plan this revolt. And then in 1775, on one night, the Kumeyaay sweep into the San Diego mission, which is pretty primitive and basic. It's kind of a wood shanty system that still even had some reeds for roofs. And they sweep in, they murder the head priest, Father Jaime. They brutalize him and throw him in a ditch. They burn the mission to the ground, and they free all of their people, never to return. The soldiers, who were supposed to be guarding Mission San Diego, have decided they really don't like this job, and they build their fort 7 miles away from the mission. That's a long distance. They see as the night goes on that the mission has gone up in smoke, and they don't show up until the next day. And by then, there's total decimation. Almost all of the Kumeyaay have fled by then. And in a rather sad march, they take the surviving priest and some of the servants and what was left of the cattle and slowly march back down to their fort at the coast. And then the soldiers go on a rampage looking for the Kumeyaay. And of course, they can't identify who the true leaders were. So they will capture and whip whoever they can, take them back to the fort. And this went on for months and months to try and get people to expose the leadership of this revolt. So that was the first and in some ways the most famous revolt. There were all kinds of individual rebellions and flights because the villages were not far away and they were starving at the missions. Sometimes it was much easier to go back to the land that they knew, and there weren't enough soldiers to really confine the hundreds of people and to feed the hundreds of people. So the soldiers become this military police force to go into the villages and retrieve the runaways. But there were runaways, that there were murders of priests. And what I didn't know is that in the middle missions around Santa Ynez, La Purísima, Santa Barbara, the Chumash people, this is in the middle part of the state, between Los Angeles and San Francisco, right at the coast. And the Chumash people organize a series of slave revolts that blend into a coordinated mass slave revolt where they torch the missions, they seize the priests, they seize a cannon, and they flee to the hinterlands. They flee to the east through what we call in California the Tule marshes, which are marshes with long, bristly, scratchy grasses. That's where the Yupik people live, and they're waiting to help the native people from the coast. They're waiting to receive them, and they hide out in the Tule marshes and then lead into the mountains for up to 2 years. Especially in the summer, there are routes of the Indian people who are hiding out from the missions, who've fled the missions, who've burnt the missions. And finally, the Spanish go in with a monster cannon that they can drag through the marshes and blow up the fortifications behind which the Chumash people were living. Some escape and some are captured.
Spain's mission system in California ended in less than 70 years. The system came to an end in the 1830s. But as Jean told us at the start of our conversation, the Spanish weren't the only people to bring slavery to California and the North American West Coast. Jean, would you tell us about the system of slavery Russia developed on the West Coast and in California? And would you also tell us something about the Pacific Triangle trade that developed? Because I think when many of us think of the Triangle trade, we're focused on the Atlantic slave trade. But as you point out in your book, California Slave State, there was also a Pacific-based triangular slave trade.
Yeah, I've bestowed that name on it because it fit. This wasn't about rum and enslaved Africans. This is a whole different story. In 1745, Bering crosses the Pacific. There are two ships that go forth from Russia, and the Tsar of Russia is funding this expedition looking for a route to China. Bering and his colleague head out. They instantly lose each other in the fog. And they're discovering that Alaska is a chain of islands and then a mainland. There are hundreds of little islands, and this is the chain of the Aleutian Islands, and it runs from very close to Russia up to the mainland of Alaska. And then if you can picture to the south of the mainland of Alaska are some large islands like Kodiak Island. Bering cannot find a route to China. He can't find his colleague's ship. He sails back to Mother Russia. He's within a few miles, actually, of the Siberian coast, and he crashes on a little rocky island. He dies in this shipwreck, and his sailors spend the winter there. By the spring, they discover that the island is surrounded by sea otters. Sea otters are the cute little ones that we have pictures of that can clap their hands together to crack a crab and lie on their back. Their young nurse on their bellies as they lie on their back. What they have is fur. They've got 1 million pieces of fur per square inch. They are the softest fur in the world. And the sailors from Bering return. They rebuild what they can from their broken ship, take it back, and sea otters are going to save the Tsar. They're going to save the Russian Empire. Those little pelts that they bring back, and I think they bring back almost 1,000 from the island with Bering, sell for, at the time, what was $3,500 per pelt. It's a fortune in money, and that starts the Russian invasion of Alaska. Island by island, finally leading up to Kodiak. At first, it's they're called Promushleniki. They're the independent fur hunters. They're violent, and it's like the gold rush. They're on these crummy little ships. They don't know what they're doing, and they realize right away that the only people who know how to hunt the sea otter are the Alaska natives. And they do it from their kayaks. They've done it for thousands upon thousands of years. They only kill the otters that they need for warmth. Think about pictures of the Chinese Mandarin class in their golden silk robes with fur around their neck and fur around the hems and maybe a fur muff to keep warm. This is the warmest fur in the world. The Russians are done in Siberia. They've depleted the ermine and the sable, and all of a sudden from Bering's shipwreck, they've got a gift from the sea. It's gold. They invade Alaska. They capture the Alaska natives. The women know how to stitch these incredible waterproof clothings made out of the gut of a seal. Sometimes they're one piece and stitched. The very, very low kayak, they're made of animal skin, so the kayaker can actually see through where the otters are. And they have beautifully decorated helmets to protect them from the sun. They know how to do this. And the Russians invade Alaska, capture the natives and the women for sex, but also for their sewing skills. And after they've decimated the Alaska Native tribes, they move further and further east onto Kodiak Island, onto the mainland. And when they've pretty much killed off the otter population, they turn right. At this point, the Russians have formed the Russian-American Company. The whole otter business has been taken over by the Tsar. And in the contracts that launched the Russian-American Company, they allow the fur hunters to enslave 50% of the men each for a period of 5 years. When they've built up this population, they turn right and head south down the Pacific coast. They skip what's now Vancouver, Victoria, British Columbia, and Washington State and Oregon because the Tlingit Indians live there. They're very militant. And they land in Northern California in Trinidad Bay. They start to move down the coast, killing otters, depositing the native Alaskans on the shore, and they build a base at what's called Fort Ross or Woodman Fort Russia, right at the northern edge of the missions. So the Spanish are right. The Russians are coming. The Russians build the slave plantation at Fort Ross, and they can't deposit the Alaska natives' land because the Spanish don't want them there. So they dump them on the Farallone Islands, which are little brutal rock outcroppings, maybe 20 miles offshore. You can barely see them from shore, outside what would now be the Golden Gate Bridge. And they deposit them there for 6 months, and then they sweep by and collect the pelts, and they give them a couple of pounds of flour. They're told to collect fresh water from the rocks. And those islands then, as now, are surrounded by sharks. So it's very hard, even though these are super skillful mariners in their kayaks, it's very hard for them to escape. And if they escape, they're only going to escape to the Spanish, who are going to capture them. So it's a brutal system, and the Russians stay until they've killed off the population of otters along the coast. After they've killed off the otters, it's time to leave. And some of the Alaska natives can escape up rivers, and we don't know their stories. They weren't people with a tradition of written culture. So they escape upriver, and I'm still not sure how many actually flee. Some of them probably were able to paddle back the 1,500 miles back to Alaska. Their islands are decimated. And finally, the Russians leave.
Thus far, we've been talking about how the Spanish and the Russians brought different ideas and practices of indigenous enslavement to California and to the rest of the North American West Coast during the mid to late 18th and early 19th centuries. Jean, you mentioned that when the Russians came to California, there was a bit of an otter gold rush. So now I'm wondering about the actual gold rush. In 1848, the United States took over territorial control of California with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo. Just before the signing of the treaty, James Marshall discovered gold on John Sutter's land in Coloma, California. This discovery caused the population of California to soar and grew very rapidly, and in 1850, the United States admitted California to its union as, quote, a free state. Jean, would you tell us about the California Gold Rush and its role in how slavery continued and changed in early California?
Yeah, the California Gold Rush generates a series of systems of slavery that come both locally and also from China. The quantity of gold is sort of beyond belief. Within the first couple of years of the gold rush, California is shipping annually $1.5 billion worth of gold to the banks and to the government of the East Coast. And people from all over the world hear of gold in California. Some of the first people in are the Argentinians and the Chileans and the Mexicans who are skilled miners. And then Chinese people come. In fact, it was easier to get from China to California than across the plains to California. And then comes the rush of African American slavery. Slave owners cross the plains with enslaved African Americans for the gold rush. There are already enslaved Africans and plantation owners who've gone out to California in 1848, even maybe a little bit earlier for land. Tobacco was harsh on land. Cotton was harsh on land. There was always the intention of taking slavery west. After the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo and around that time, Texas becomes very favorable to slavery. In fact, there were 200,000 enslaved Africans growing cotton in Texas just about this time. And slave owners are going to transport people to work for them in the gold mines. They're not going to bring a lot. Probably between 1,500 and 2,000 enslaved African Americans are carried across the plains against their will to work for their owners, panning for gold. It was a rough trip. The enslaved people are given the worst jobs. Generally, their job was to manage the oxen, which meant that enslaved men and some women walked across the plains from Mississippi and Missouri, and then up and over the Rockies, and then through the valleys, sometimes crossing the Mojave Desert, sometimes further north, and then up and over the Sierra Mountains because the gold was on the western or Pacific slope of the Sierras. So suddenly in California, they're enslaved African Americans. Free Blacks also come to California. They come for the same reason as everybody else, is for gold and the opportunity that was not happening for them in the North. But they also have the 1850 fugitive slave law at their back. Frederick Douglass at first doesn't want free Blacks to go to California. He's not yet aware of the quantity of enslaved Blacks in California. But he says, if you folks leave, you're abandoning the abolition movement. And they say, Douglas, everybody else is going. This is our one chance. Plus, we've got the fugitive slave law at our back. And he says to some of the leaders, if you travel with me for the summer and learn how to become abolitionist leaders and speakers, then you go with my blessing. And people like Peter Lester, Mifflin Wistar Gibbs, work with Douglas, and then they go to California. And it's there that there's this surprise encounter between enslaved Blacks and free Blacks in California. And the free Blacks work very hard to rescue, hide, protect enslaved Blacks. They start a series of lawsuits. There are 4 colored conventions in California. Colored conventions are happening all over the United States where thousands of Black people would freely meet to talk about schools and freedom and religion. And they call for 3 colored conventions before the Civil War in California. What they want is the right to testify. I kept reading these minutes thinking, where's the demand for freedom? What I didn't understand is that in the California Constitution, neither Blacks, Indians, nor Chinese people could testify in court. But if you're a free person, a free Black person, and you're not allowed to enter into evidence your freedom papers, you're vulnerable to being enslaved. So California reproduces a lot of the slave codes, both from the South, more importantly from the North, of how to take a free people and enslave them. I think we need to dip back to the California Constitution because California passes a, quote, free constitution. Remember, there's going to be this balance. We're going to admit one free state for every slave state, the, quote, great compromise. There's no state to match with California. And the United States wants that $1.5 billion a year really bad. They are going to admit California and they're going to admit it as a free state. And at the Constitutional Convention, where Californians write their constitution, it's run by slaveholders. And at that constitution, they say slavery will never be tolerated in California. Tolerate is not a legal standard. You and I can say we won't tolerate that. It has no force of law. So they have built an out into the Constitution. And then they start copying laws from the East, from the North, that maintains slavery in the northern states. With those laws, and with passing its own fugitive slave law of 1852, California legalizes Black slavery.
California has a long and unique history with slavery. that differs from the history of slavery that we often associate with the early United States, mostly with the East Coast. Jean, often when we talk about the history of slavery in United States history, we're really talking about the slavery that developed in the British American context and then expanded into the United States context after 1776. So would you tell us why we don't necessarily talk about slavery in California as much as we talk about Black chattel slavery of the colonial and early republic periods?
We don't look at slavery in California because we live with the myth that slavery was only African American slavery. We live with the myth that slavery is over, and we are not looking at human trafficking. There is a vast silence in the archives that if you want to look for slavery in California, you have to back into it and look through local tribal histories or Chinese American histories, where Chinese girls were kidnapped from the port cities of Guangdong and sold on the docks of San Francisco, strip searched and sold into prostitution, initially to service the, quote, bachelor community of men who came out for the gold rush. It doesn't sit comfortably with Christianity and the notions of conversion. We haven't listened to the voices of the enslaved people. Once we get into the archives, it's sitting right beneath the surface. The research that I found was vast. I found 5 African American slave narratives, like Frederick Douglass's or Harriet Jacobs or Harriet Wilson's. These were the people who we read and taught. We didn't even think to look for slave narratives from California. And it's counter of the illusions of California that the fulsome of life in California, the people who live there know.
We should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Jean, in your opinion, what would have happened if California had entered the American Union in 1850 as a slave state rather than as a stated free state? How do you think California's status as an official slave state would have impacted California's history and the development of the state?
As I write in California, a slave state, it in fact did enter as a slave state. What my challenge was to unpack that illusion that it entered as a free state. It copied codes from the North, like the Sojourner Code that said that a slaveholder could keep a slave with him if he intended to leave, but there was no dateline on how soon you intended to leave. I didn't know that the capture and forced indenture of Native Americans was California's very first law. I didn't know that there was an underground railroad in California and that there was a mass exodus in 1858 of 800 African Americans who fled together over a period of a few weeks to Vancouver. So I think that it's taking apart an illusion of class, of whiteness, of safety, of freedom, of the summer of love, or easy profits, or Hollywood that drew people to California, despite authors like Steinbeck, who talked about the Depression in California and poverty in California, or despite the fact that the Chinese organized the first farm worker strikes in American history in California. So I think we're living with a series of myths. And once we tell the truth and read the truth, then the question will unpack itself, because California was and has been a slave state. Right now, it's the 5th most populous site of human trafficking in the United States. people are being brought into California to work in the canneries, to work in the fields, to work in the marijuana grows, to work in the sex trade, to work in factories, to work in sweatshops. And I think that it's just important that the question be flipped and acknowledged that this is a history, but it's also a history of slave revolts. It changes the narrative when we think about the revolts at the missions, or we think about the laws that African Americans pushed through so that they could have the right to testify and establish that they were free, or the Chinese enslaved prostitutes who flee from being kept in cages on Jackson Street in San Francisco. 20 times a day, their sexual services were sold. And when they can flee, they're some of the founders of all the Chinatowns across Northern California. So I think looking at this history with eyes wide open really expands the idea that California, which is the most multiracial state in the country, and where every ethnicity lives in California, once that true story becomes told, then the idea of what if changes into notions of the courage and determination of California people to be free.
California, a slave state, is an impressive history of the history of slavery in California, and we've only just scratched the surface of what's in Jean's book. Jean, you've written this very impressive tome on slavery and its long history in California, and I wonder, are you sticking with this topic, or are you working on something new?
I'm sitting on all kinds of archives of voices of the enslaved, from the missions, from testimonies and confessions that the priests transcribed, slave narratives of African Americans, letters between Chinese women about their lives, legends of Native Americans of how they found their freedom and what happened to their people, current court cases of trafficked people testifying. The history of San Quentin Prison is the history of unfree convict labor, and there are prison diaries. So what I'm doing now is creating a reader, if you will, a collection of the voices of the enslaved in California, so that readers can hear the story from themselves and hear it in the first person, from the people who were captured and who fled and figured out a way to tell their stories.
Jean, if we have more questions about the history of slavery in California, is there a good way we can reach out and ask you our questions?
Yes, and I'm delighted to answer them. Probably the easiest way to locate me is through my webpage. It's www.jeanfelzer, JeanPfaelzer.com. My email is readily available and public. It's my last name at udel.edu. So I'm not hard to find, and I'm very eager to have these conversations.
Jean Felzer, thank you for taking us through some of the early history of California and the state's very long history with slavery.
Oh, thank you for your questions, and thank you for welcoming me.
Rich in natural resources, California proved to be a land of abundance for the approximately 250 indigenous nations who resided there before European colonization. California, then as now, has a rich diversity of growing zones, seasons, and climates, which is in part why the state has emerged as a breadbasket of the United States and has become known as an agricultural paradise of sorts. The state's growing zones and soils not only support the growth of wheat and corn, but fresh fruits, nuts, and leafy greens. Plus, California also has forests to supply trees and support larger game animals for hunting. It has a very long coastline that supplies fish and sea life, and several large lakes and rivers that also supply fish and support smaller game animals. With such an abundance of natural agricultural produce to feed and sustain themselves, the indigenous peoples of California weren't often engaged in warfare. And without regular and prolonged periods of warfare, the indigenous peoples of California did not often take war captives, which also means they did not develop a regular practice of slavery to employ war captives. But then the Spanish came in 1769. They arrived in the area of present-day San Diego, and they arrived with a plan to execute. As Jean revealed, the Spanish sought to accomplish 3 goals in colonizing California. First, they sought to block Russian and later English expansion into the North American West Coast. Spain believed that by establishing colonies in California, it would cement its imperial claims to the region. Second, Spain believed that by establishing primarily agricultural settlements in California, its people could focus on growing enough food to support its troubled Catholic missions in Mexico and its mining operations in Mexico and Peru. And third, Spain intended to fulfill its papal-ordered religious mission to convert California's indigenous peoples to Catholicism. Spain's imperial ambitions relied on slavery. Using enslaved indigenous labor in California to grow crops meant freeing up enslaved labor in Mexico and Peru to work in Spanish gold and silver mines. Likewise, the Russians, Americans, and Chinese, who came at various points in California's history, also had ambitions that relied on slavery. The Russians enslaved indigenous peoples to hunt sea otters. The Americans and Chinese, who flooded into California after the discovery of gold in 1848, also relied on enslaved labor to build and assist their mining operations. So unlike some regions of the United States, which developed practices of first indigenous and then African chattel slavery, California has experience with indigenous, African and African American, Chinese, and other systems of slavery. This makes California a great case study as we try to better understand the United States' complex history with slavery and systems of labor. Look for more information about Jean, her book, California Slave State, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/387. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so please tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other aspects of early California or Western history would you like to investigate? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.